To get started, I want to thank you once again for taking the time to join our webinar this morning on external endpoints, offering ESS to employees from home. Great presentation for you here today with Mr. Jeff House and Mr. Richard Stout. It's our first broadcast from our Tampa offices, and it's the first of 4 webinars that we have today that are technically oriented. If you haven't seen the other ones, you can find them at rpic.com/webinars. I have a couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. Number one is we encourage questions. It's very helpful to break up the dynamic a little bit, get that feedback loop going. So if you got something specific you want to know, now's the time to ask. We'll be happy to try to answer that. Second, very importantly, we will be recording this webinar and we will be putting it on YouTube at some point. Sometimes it takes us a little while to get it edited and rendered. And with that, I give you Mr. Jeff House, Mr. Richard Lee Stout.
All right. Thanks, Keith.
I apologize. Oh.
Oh, good.
Okay. You want to do the About Us part?
Oh, I'd be happy to, Jeff. Thanks.
All right, awesome.
We are RPI consultants, over 60 strong, with specializations across the spectrum of Infor Lawson products. We are headquartered in Baltimore, Maryland, and happy to be broadcasting from our technology office in sunny Tampa, Florida today.
So welcome. Thank you so much for joining. This is going to be a pretty short presentation. It shouldn't take us more than 15 to 30 minutes to get through all of the material. I thank you so much for joining. We're going to talk about several things that you need to know about setting up your ESS to allow employees to access it from home. This is going to go over several of the key components that you need to set up in order to make this happen, and then also we'll talk a little bit about the security and risks and some of the things that you can do to minimize those. So we're going to go over how to set up some endpoints and domains in SSO config. We're going to also cover some rule files that you have in ISS that you may or may not know about, and then also a little bit about security. So the age-old dilemma.
I want my ESS.
Right, child of the 80s here. So I want my ESS. If you're a millennial, you're not going to get that because you're all into Teen Mom. MTV actually played music at one point, believe it or not. So the employee is always saying, I want to access my information from home. I don't want to be bound to sitting here at the office to get my paychecks, to change my direct deposit. I want to be able to do it from the comfort of my home. But a network administrator is always like, no, that's way too much. We do not want to publish our Lawson data externally, and with good reason. I mean, you're really publishing some sensitive information out there on the internet. That clever people might be able to go and get.
Yes, but with the techniques that Mr. House is going to show you today, we can ensure that your business ERP data is protected from access through the external endpoint while still allowing the normal amount of access while in the office.
Right. And how do we do that? Well, first we have to click the button to advance the slide.
Yes.
Again.
Sometimes the button's name is Scott.
Yes. So if you hear me say Scott, then that means button. So here we have 2 places. We have our office up at the top. That's our Baltimore office. And then at the bottom we have our home. And both of these can end up being endpoints into our LSF system. So we have an endpoint for our internal network, and then we have an endpoint for our external network. But the thing is that, okay, we've been able to do this for years and set up multiple endpoints in LSF, but now how do we get this added layer of security on top of it to be able to do exactly what we want? And that layer is ISS. So ISS is going to be the bridge between our home office and our regular office. We're going to bridge them together, and I'm going to show you how. In this diagram, you can see, a brief display of how we need to set everything up to enable our ESS from home. We have to have a web server published out into the DMZ. We're going to have to set up an external domain, an external endpoint, and then also we're going to publish our WebSphere plugin to that external web server. All communication then goes back into the internal application server to render our content. Now, one of the common mistakes that ends up getting made when doing this setup is ports are not properly opened on the firewall to communicate between the web server and the WebSphere application server. So as you go through this, make sure that you analyze what ports your WebSphere config is using in order to keep this communication open. It's going to have to go both ways.
Right.
So it is going to be a collaboration between you and your network administrators.
That's in your virtual host setup in WebSphere. Typically, you'd run this over port 443, the standard SSL port.
Correct. So those are all the things that we need. All right, perfect. So now here's what you need to set up in SSO config in order to add your endpoints. First thing you have to do is you're going to have to set up a domain. Now you have multiple domains, and don't think of a domain as like a Windows domain or anything. This is really anything that you want to call it. It's a domain unique to your SSO config. So you can see on here I have an example of internal and external. Pretty simple, but it does get the point across.
That is the standard nomenclature that we'd see in an LSF. Right?
That's correct. I always have a joke that if you want to name it Strawberry, you can. And I always say that one day somebody's going to take me up on it, and I'm going to see Strawberry out there somewhere. So once you have a domain, then you have to specify an endpoint. An endpoint is a fully qualified domain name as to where your web traffic is coming from. If my internal server is called lawson.company.com, then I would create an endpoint called lawson.company.com. That's what you're going to currently see now. As I go to set up my external, I may want to call it EMSS. I want or ESS or my portal, whatever your branding is for your employee self-service.
And of course, your external domain name needs to be real, because whatever name you choose here needs to be set up in your external DNS servers.
That's correct, because you want to be able to hit it from outside. It has to know about it.
Yes.
All right. So once you have these endpoints, you're going to have to assign your endpoints to services. We've listed all of those out. So this is just an exercise in repetition of assigning these endpoints to the iOS, the BPM, the SSOP, and the LS admin services. Then you also have to create an endpoint group and assign the endpoint to the endpoint group. Generally, you're just going to have one, so you might name it just like we see here, an internal endpoint group and an external endpoint group, and then we tie them together.
Yes.
So right here, this tells you everything that you need to know in a nutshell within SSO config.
Great.
Okay, so now let's get into how we can deal with some rules. So there are some rule files that we have that can essentially filter out the content that we're going to render through certain endpoints. These rule files are written in XML. Thankfully, there's for employee self-service, there's some default files that are delivered, and we can easily apply those. There's an example on the next page to illustrate this concept. So we've made up our Lawson security profile. Everybody, this is not an exercise in security, but everybody knows that security is made up of a security class. A security class is assigned to a role is assigned to a user. Security classes are reused. A user may have one or more roles assigned to them. That makes up their whole profile. So when I'm inside, you can see that I have all of these these options. I have my GL40 and I have my PO20. I'm a finance user. But I also have access to HR11 because I'm allowed to update my address through employee self-service. Your loss and security is configured properly, so that way I can do everything in finance and I can only update my own record within HR. Very standard stuff. But now, if you only want the employee to be able to access employee self-service from home and not be able to do GL transactions, purchase orders, for whatever reason, maybe they're hourly and you don't want them to have to worry about clocking in and out, or there's some sort of other.
Or maybe, let's say I'm a hacker and I've captured the username and password of our finance director. I can log in to ESS as that user, but even though our finance director has full access to the GL while in the office, this rule set will prevent access to those tables and tokens when I access Lawson from the external endpoint.
That's right, and that comes in very handy, and it's pretty simple to do. As you can see on the external side, we've knocked them out. Now our files, here's an example of what the default file looks like. In our gender assembly products SHR rules, that's a mouthful, you're going to find the default files that you need in order to implement ESS. There are, I think, three or four, one for ESS, one for MSS, and one for Gen. Those will give you full access to everything required for employee self-service and employee self-service only. Now remember that employee self-service does encompass some things within the HR suite, so you still are going to have access to to some things HR. If you have full access to HR, then you're going to have full access to HR. Your Lawson security profile is your Lawson security profile. We're just filtering out what tokens and what tables, what system codes you're able to access through a specific endpoint. Once you have the rule files you want, you have to place them on your LSF server in that Lauder security domain auth, and then whatever domain name you said, probably external, and then whatever the rule file name is. So if you have more than one XML file, then you will have more than one file in that directory. So now we're getting into ISS, and we're getting into the actual configuration of how to set this up. We've already set everything up in SSO config at the command line. Now we have to go into ISS, and then we have to manage our domains. Now this is really just to make sure that you can do your rule files, and then also you can do an external portal role, which I'm going to get to in a second. But if you go into the SSO section of ISS and manage domains, you're going to see that you may have one or more in there. In this case, we have two. We have one for internal, and then in this case, we had to be froggy and called it Kermit external. So once you're into the domain, you have three different things that you can edit. Under the general tab, notice here that we have a role file name. So we're saying that our role file name is external role.xml. So let's go back to the example of me being a finance user. I have full access to my portal. I see my search box, I have all my bookmarks, I have a full portal experience. Your employees that, if you're in a hospital situation, your nurse may only have an ESS role, and therefore he or she is only going to see the bookmarks for employee self-service. They're not going to have a search box. They have a totally different experience. You have the ability to control from a specific endpoint which portal role you access at that endpoint. So therefore, when I come in through emss.company.com, I could have the same experience as a nurse has, whether I'm internal or external. So therefore, I can knock out some of those added security risks, such as the search box.
Yeah, that's a great way to customize the screen for the external endpoint access only and make it clear that when logging into the system through the outside, ESS is the only portion of Lawson that you're going to be able to reach.
Now, one thing to note too as well, this is for publishing, Portal or Infor Lawson for Mingle. Those are not necessarily required in order to access employee self-service.
That's right.
If you want to publish just, say, viewing your paychecks or updating your address, changing your direct deposit, some of those things, but not allow other functions of ESS, you're more than welcome to build your own custom intranet page and link directly to those ESS pages.
Right. ESS, as we know, relies on Portal bookmarks as a method of navigation. It's the menu to get into ESS. But you can choose not to use the bookmarks, not to deploy Mingle or Portal outside, and simply set up a basic HTML page to allow users to navigate into the specific ESS pages that you want to make available.
And the user will still be prompted to authenticate, so they will still get the normal sign-in page to put their credentials in. It's not just wide open, hey, look at me, here's my direct deposit information for the world to see.
Yeah.
It's definitely not that. Okay, so now for your rule files, notice on the right-hand side of this screen, we have the MSS app, ESS app, and then the EMSS Gen. Those are our rule file names without the XML extension. Those files are located in that domain auth domain name rulefile.xml. So we have to manually add these rule files to our external domain, and this sets that filter that we were talking about. So therefore, in this situation, only rules that are in those XML files are going to be applied to this specific endpoint.
Yeah.
And then I highlighted the buttons up at the top. They're in red to enable or disable. So let's say you want this enabled for a little while, but maybe later on you want to turn it off, and you may turn it back on. You don't have to go through a whole lot of setup. You can simply just go into ISS, click the button, and then it's enabled or disabled.
Yeah. Or the Scott.
Exactly. So so the next thing is a little bit about security. So there are two files out there that you can edit, and there's documentation on what's contained in these files, and it's going to be individual to to your specific entity. But the Lawson Security VA.properties file is going to be dealing with cookies. So how you handle cookies within your endpoint. And then the XSS validator properties file is to help eliminate cross-site scripting attacks.
Yeah. So these are vulnerability mitigation techniques. They're optional, but there are some various settings here that can be enabled depending on what level of security you'd like to apply. Take a look through and see what's appropriate for your organization and the access you're trying to give.
And it might be just a matter of trying different properties in those files as well to suit your needs.
Yeah, the right balance between productivity and restriction.
Correct. And if you want more information on the vulnerability mitigation, you can use the Resources and Security Admin Guide. And also, don't forget about your LSF Info Center. That's a world of information. A lot of people forget about that.
Yeah.
So a little bit of additional information for you where a lot of this was gathered. You can see here to do some further reading on your own. Don't forget your required versions. That you need to be fairly current. I would think that most people are at least at this level by now. Notice that you do still have the 901 option to you as well if you want to enable it. I know most people are in 10 or at least a 10 pack.
But this capability came out about 2 years ago now. So if you're within the Infor N-2 versioning, you probably are at the level you need to be.
Correct.
And with that, we'll take some questions.
So we have some questions. You guys will probably have to repeat them to let people know. You know what the no, we can't do it. Okay. So question number one: you mentioned a hacker getting into ESS and not having access to some forms based on XML rules, but the hacker still has access to ESS as that user and could change direct deposit address, etc. Is there an option for two-factor authentication for ESS?
So the question goes back to our scenario where a black hat has gained the username and password of one of our employees and is attempting to log in as that person, and we've covered blocking out access to other parts of the Lawson system not relating to ESS. But there's a lot of damage that someone could potentially do just with ESS. The suggestion from our audience member, who seems to have thought this over quite thoroughly, is can we change the direct deposit? What if our black hat changed the direct deposit information on an employee to intercept a salary? Is there anything that we can do through ESS to help prevent that possibility? And does this solution offer the possibility of two-factor authentication? So the answer is that out of the box, Infor does not have a two-factor authentication solution for Lawson. There are other third-party vendors that provide that. We have worked with a couple in the past, but it's not part of the Infor solution. And I'm not sure how else we would try to prevent a change of direct deposit information other than maybe making that screen unavailable from home. To say that's one screen that you'd have to be in the office to get to.
And you could use the rule file to do that.
Yeah.
So if there's no two-factor authentication and that isn't a concern, which rightfully so, then you could just make it so that those, is it the PR12 screen, right? That's direct deposit, would be denied through your rule file. So therefore, the employee would not be able to update direct deposit from home. That's probably the easiest way to, or the simplest way to do it.
Yeah.
Next question: can the Mingle UI be used externally, or must you use EMSS for external access?
So the next question is regarding Mingle. Can Mingle be made available externally? And the answer there is it's not recommended. Infor does not recommend making Mingle available outside the firewall. That's just a much larger potential attack surface. And although many organizations have SharePoint available to the internet at large, that's certainly a significant potential attack surface. And of course, it means you need to keep your SharePoint deployment patched to catch any latest vulnerabilities that are released. And that could be a challenge when it comes to compatibility with the rest of the Infor code that plugs into Mingle. So I wouldn't really recommend it, although it's possible if you needed to.
Thank you very much for taking the time to attend this presentation. Want to let you know we have 3 more going on today. At noon, we have Powering Up Your Rec Approvals. Great webinar by Mr. Richard Stout, Stephanie Colwell. At 2 p.m., we're going to be talking Cloud Tech with Richard Stout and Chip Cunningham. And at 3:30 p.m. in the Eastern Time today, live from RPI's temp offices, we will be talking about the implications of ending mainstream support for Windows 2008. For those of you that run Infor Lawson on Windows 2008, You can register for all those on rpic.com/webinars. Once again, thank you for attending. Have a great day.